All right. I believe that we are going to have a drama-free morning today in terms of our video. We've been having some complications all week long, and Lord willing, I hope that we have resolved them. And we are also live streaming by our YouTube channel. So if anything goes wrong with Periscope, you can catch the replay as well on our YouTube channel at Church Love 333. So welcome, welcome, welcome. We are back reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. Between the World and Me. And I'm also holding this up for my YouTube live stream as well. So Ta-Nehisi ended our reading yesterday. We probably got about maybe 2 or 3 more days before we complete this book, and this will be our last book talk for the year. And hopefully maybe at the end I'll show you some of the books that we're going to be reading going into 2017. So if you're interested in joining us for our continued book talks, they will continue beginning January 2017. But yesterday he left us off with some very, very sobering messages concerning Black men and Black fathers and their ability to protect their children in a world where they don't themselves feel protected. And that was kind of one of the things that I took away from what Ta-Nehisi was saying. And one of the things that we ended with talking about was his burden of living among dreamers. And he said that there's an extra burden of your country telling you that the dream they've created is just and noble and real, and that you are crazy for seeing the corruption and smelling the sulfur. So, he basically kind of ends by telling his son that he wants him to be a conscious citizen of the world, both the beauty of the world and even some of the terrible things that happen in our world. And I think that is actually a very good lesson that, one of the things that I say many times about this current generation that is now being racially traumatized is that many of them are not prepared, right? Many of them are not prepared for the level of hatred that has been displayed even since the election. All of the data shows that there has been an uptick or an increase in the amount of hate crimes being done, not just towards Black people, but towards Hispanic people, towards Asian people, towards those who share a different faith, towards the Muslim community. So there has been an uptick in the hate crimes that have been going on. So when people say, oh, people are just exaggerating or they need to get over it, the reality is the facts show otherwise. The reality is the facts show that there is a direct link between the election and the increase in hate crimes. I think there was a total report of like 700 hate crimes since the election. So that should concern anybody who cares anything about humanity, whether you believe what somebody believes or whether you're a part of that people group or not. You should not want people to be harmed simply for being different from you. All right. So one of the things that I encourage adults and I encourage parents to do is to, don't leave your child in the dark about what is going on, because when you do that, you leave your child unprepared for a world that they're going to enter, right? Because we don't live in heaven right now. We live on this earth. And that means that because of the way this earth is set up, your child is going to encounter the good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful, the amazing, and the tragic. So you can't just paint this picture of the world as just being this perfect thing where nothing bad ever happens. Because when you do that, or when you lead your child to think that, then when something bad does happen, or tragedy strikes, or trauma occurs, God forbid, then they are set up to have their entire world view shattered. And so I can appreciate Tanehisi writing this book to his son and wanting his son to not have illusions about what the world is really like. So we're going to go into our next section today, and then we're going to see what we will learn and glean from Ta-Nehisi today. Let's go. One day, I was in Chicago reporting a story about the history of segregation in the urban North and how it was engineered by government policy. I was trailing some officers of the county sheriff as they made their rounds. That day, I saw a black man losing his home. I followed the sheriff's officers inside the house where a group of them were talking to the man's wife, who was also trying to tend to her 2 children. She had clearly not been warned that the sheriff would be coming, though something in her husband's demeanor told me he must have known. His wife's eyes registered all at once, shock at the circumstance, anger at the officers, and anger at her husband. The officer stood in the man's living room giving him orders as to what would now happen. Outside, there were men who'd been hired to remove the family's possessions. The man was humiliated, and I imagine that he had probably for some time carried in his head alone all that was threatening his family, but could not bring himself to admit it to himself or his wife. So he now changed all that energy into anger directed at the officers. He cursed, he yelled, he pointed wildly. This particular sheriff's department was more progressive than most. They were concerned about mass incarceration. They would often bring a social worker to an eviction, but this had nothing to do with the underlying and relentless logic of the world this man inhabited. A logic built on laws, built on history, built on contempt for this man and his family and their fate. The man ranted on. When the officers turned away, he ranted more to the group of black men assembled who'd been hired to sit his family out on the street. His manner was like all the powerless black people I'd ever known, exaggerating their bodies to conceal a fundamental plunder that they could not prevent. I had spent the week exploring the city, walking through its vacant lots, watching the aimless boys sitting in the pews of the striving churches, reeling before the street murals to the dead. And I would from time to time sit in the humble homes of black people in that city who were entering their 10th decade of life. These people were profound. Their homes were filled with the emblems of honorable life, citizenship awards, portraits of husbands and wives passed away, several generations of children in cap and gown. And they had drawn these accolades by cleaning big houses and living in one-room Alabama shacks before moving to the city. They had done this despite the city, which was supposed to be arrested, revealing itself to simply be a more intricate specimen of plunder. They had worked 2 and 3 jobs, put children through high school and college, and become pillars of their community. I admired them, but I knew the whole time that I was merely encountering the survivors, the ones who'd endured the banks in their stone-faced contempt, the realtors, and their fake sympathy. I'm sorry that house just sold yesterday. The realtors who steered them back toward ghetto blocks or blocks earmarked to be ghettos soon. The lenders who found this captive class and tried to strip them of everything they had. In those homes, I saw the best of us, but behind each of them, I knew that there were so many millions gone. And I knew that there were children born into these same caged neighborhoods on the west side, these ghettos, each of which was as planned as any subdivision. They are an elegant act of racism, killing fields authored by federal policies, where we are all again plundered of our dignity, of our families, of our wealth, and of our lives. And there is no difference between the killing of Prince Jones and the murders attending these killing fields, because both are rooted in the assumed inhumanity of black people. A legacy of plunder, a network of laws and traditions, a heritage, a dream, murdered Prince Jones as sure as it murders black people in the North Lawndale with frightening regularity. Black on black crime is jargon, violence to language, which banishes the men who engineered the covenants, who fixed the loans, who planned the projects, who built the streets and sold red ink by the barrel. And this should not surprise us. The plunder of black life was grilled into this country in its infancy and reinforced across its history so that plunder has become an heirloom, an intelligence, a sentience, a default setting to which, likely to the end of our days, must invariably return. The killing fields of Chicago, of Baltimore, of Detroit were created by the policy of dreamers, but their weight, their shame rests solely upon those who are dying in them. There is a great deception in this. To yell, "Black on black cry," is to shoot a man and then shame him for bleeding. And the premise that allows for these killing fields, the reduction of the black body, is no different than the premise that allowed for the murder of Prince Jones. The dream of acting white, of talking white, of being white murdered Prince Jones as sure as it murders black people in Chicago with frightening regularity. Do not accept the lie. Do not drink from the poison. The same hands that drew red lines around the life of Prince Jones drew red lines around the ghetto. I did not want to raise you in fear or false memory. I did not want you forced to mask your joys and bind your eyes. What I wanted for you was to grow into consciousness. I resolved to hide nothing from you. Do you remember when I first took you to work? When you were 13, I was going to see the mother of a dead black boy. The boy had exchanged hard words with a white man and had been killed because he refused to turn down his music. The killer, having emptied his gun, drove his girlfriend to a hotel. They had drinks. They ordered a pizza. And then the next day at his leisure, the man turned himself in. The man claimed to have seen a shotgun. He claimed to have been in fear of his life and to only have triumphed through righteous violence. I was the victim and the victor, he asserted, much as generations of American plunderers had asserted before. No shotgun was ever found. The claim still influenced the jury, and the killer was convicted not of the boy's murder, but of firing repeatedly as the boy's friends tried to retreat. Destroying the black body was permissible, but it would be better to do it efficiently. That was the lesson that was taught. The mother of this murdered black boy was then taking her case before journalists and writers. We met her in the lobby of the Times Square Hotel. She was medium height with brown skin and hair down to her shoulders. It had not been a week since the verdict, but she was composed and wholly self-possessed. She did not rage at the killer, but wondered aloud if the rules she'd imparted had been enough. She had wanted her son to stand for what he believed and to be respectful. And he had died for believing his friends had a right to play their music loud, to be American teenagers. Still, she was left wondering. In my mind, I keep saying, had he not spoke up, would he still be here? She would not forget the uniqueness of her son, his singular life. She would not forget that he had a father who loved him, who took him in while she battled cancer. She would not forget that he was the life of the party, that he always had new friends for her to shuttle around in her minivan. And she would have him live on in her work. I told her the verdict angered me. I told her that the idea that someone on that jury thought it plausible there was a gun in the car baffled the mind. She said that she was baffled too, and that I should not mistake her calm probing for the absence of anger. But God had focused her anger away from revenge and toward redemption, she said. God had spoken to her and committed her to a new activism. Then the mother of the murdered boy rose, turned to you and said, you exist. You matter. You have value. You have every right to wear your hoodie, to play your music as loud as you want. You have every right to be you, and no one should deter you from being you. You have to be you, and you can never be afraid to be you. I was glad she said this. I've tried to say the same to you, and if I had not said it with the same direction and clarity, I confess that is because I am afraid, and I have no God to hold me up. And I believe that when they shatter the body, they shatter everything. And I knew that all of us, Christians, Muslims, atheists, lived in this fear of this truth. Disembodiment is a kind of terrorism, and the threat of it alters the orbit of all our lives like terrorism. This distortion is intentional. Disembodiment. The dragon that compelled the boys I knew way back into extravagant theater of ownership. Disembodiment. The demon that pushed the middle-class black survivors into aggressive passivity. Our conversation restrained in public quarters, our best manners on display, our hands never out of pockets, our whole manner ordered as if to say, I make no sudden moves. Disembodiment. The serpent of school years demanding I be twice as good, though I was but a boy. Murder was all around us, and we knew deep in ourselves, in some silent space, that the author of these murders was beyond us, and that it suited some other person's ends. We were right. So that's our first section. Let's go back to some of the things that he said today, and I believe I alluded to it yesterday, but I'll talk about it again. This whole notion of when black people demand justice, demand to be treated humanely. This whole notion of people yelling almost like a heckler, black on black crime, right? You can literally talk about anything you want to concerning injustices in the black community, and somebody, I don't care, somebody will shout black on black crime like it is the end all be all to the issues in the black community. As he says here, black on black crime, violence to language, which banishes the men who engineered the covenants, who fixed the loans, who planned the projects, who built the streets, and sold red ink by the barrel. What is he saying? What is he saying? He's saying that to yell, as he says, black on black crime, is to shoot a man and then shame him for bleeding. It is to create the circumstances that make it right for the crime to happen, and then hide your hand like you had nothing to do with it. And this is what America consistently does when it talks about black on black crime. That's one of the reasons why God is going to deal with us as a nation. I know we don't think it's coming. I know people don't think it's happening. I know people think God is winking at all of this stuff, but I promise you he's not. I promise you he's not. God is a God of justice, and he looks at both sides, not just the side we present to make ourselves look innocent and to make ourselves seem as if we're not complicit in what is happening in our country. The other thing he says here, excuse me, the other thing he says here is there is this notion of, as he calls it, righteous violence, right? The guy who, and I do remember this incident, it was in Jacksonville, Florida, and the young boy's name was Jordan Davis. The guy felt as though his only resort to telling a child to turn down their music, and because he couldn't get them to turn down the music, his only resort was pulling out a gun and shooting multiple times into a car. Like, how deranged do you have to be for that to be your only response to teenagers not wanting to follow your instructions? Just think about that. This is why I am not in favor of teachers having guns in school. Think about that. Because I can't even imagine if teachers had guns in school and a student didn't do what you wanted, and all of a sudden you pulled out a gun and started shooting students in your classroom. Like, some people need psych evaluations They do, before they handle a gun. I'm all for Second Amendments with sane people. But clearly, this man in this case that he's talking about was not sane. You don't pull out a gun and shoot into a car because teenagers won't turn down their music. So, again, he says, which is important, this man was not convicted for murder. He was convicted for firing repeatedly at the other children who were in the car that were trying to retreat. So it gives the impression, again, that destroying the black body is permissible. There was a verdict recently just here in North Carolina where they said the officers, nobody's going to be charged in the shooting of Keith Lamont Scott, even though the video evidence shows that someone should be charged. They've decided that destroying that black body was permissible. So let's keep going with our second half of our reading today. Here is how I take the measure of my progress in life. I imagine myself as I was back there in West Baltimore, dodging north in Pulaski, ducking Murphy Homes, fearful of the school and the streets. And I imagine showing that lost boy a portrait of my present life and asking him, what would he make of it? Only once in the 2 years after your birth, in the first 2 rounds of the fight of my life, have I believed he would have been disappointed. I write you at the precipice of my 40th year, having come to a point in my life, not of great prominence, but far beyond anything that boy could have even imagined. I did not master the streets because I could not read the body language quick enough. I did not master the schools because I could not see where any of it could possibly lead. But I did not fall. I have my family, I have my work. I no longer feel it necessary to hang my head at parties and tell people that I am trying to be a writer. And godless though I am, the fact of being human, the fact of possessing the gift of study, and thus being remarkable among all the matter floating through the cosmos still awes me. I've spent much of my studies searching for the right question by which I might fully understand the breach between the world and me. I've not spent my time studying the problem of race. Race itself is just a restatement and retrenchment of the problem. You see this from time to time when some dullard, usually believing himself white, proposes that the way forward is a grand orgy of black and white, ending only when we are all beige and thus the same race. But a great number of black people are already beige. And the history of civilization is littered with dead races. Frankish, Italian, German, Irish, later abandoned because they no longer serve their purpose, the organization of people beneath and beyond the umbrella of rights. If my life ended today, I would tell you it was a happy life, that I drew great joy from the study, from the struggle toward which I now urge you. You have seen in this conversation that the struggle has ruptured and remade me several times over, in Baltimore, at the Mecca, in fatherhood, in New York. The changes have awarded me a rapture that comes only when you can no longer be lied to, when you have rejected the dream. But even more, the changes have taught me how to best exploit that singular gift of study. To question what I see, then to question what I see after that, because the answers matter as much, perhaps more than the answers. But oh my eyes, when I was a boy, no portion of my body suffered more than my eyes. If I've done well by the measures of childhood, it must be added that those measures themselves are hampered by how a little boy of my captive class has seen me. The dream seemed to be the pinnacle then, to grow rich and live in one of those disconnected houses out in the country, in one of those small communities, one of those cul-de-sacs with its gently curving ways where they staged teen movies and children built tree houses, and in that last lost year before college, teenagers made love in cars parked at the lake. The dream seemed to be the end of the world for me, the height of American ambition. What more could possibly exist beyond the dispatches, beyond the suburbs? Your mother knew. Perhaps it was because she was raised within the physical borders of such a place because she lived in proximity with the dreamers. Perhaps it was because the people who thought they were white told her she was smart and followed this up by telling her she was not really black, meaning it as a compliment. Perhaps as was the boys out there who were in fact black, telling her she was pretty for a dark-skinned girl. Your mother never felt quite at home, and this made the possibility of some other place essential to her, propelling her to the Mecca, propelling her to New York, and then beyond. On her 30th birthday, she took a trip to Paris. I'm not sure you remember. You were only 6. I'm not sure. We spent that week eating fried fish for breakfast and cake for dinner, leaving underwear on the counter and blasting Ghostface Killer. It had never occurred to me to leave America, not even temporarily. My eyes. My friend Jelani, who came up the same as me, once said that he used to think of traveling as a pointless luxury, like blowing the rent check on a pink suit. And I felt much the same then. I was bemused at your mother's dreams of Paris. I could not understand them, and I did not think I needed to. Some part of me was still back in that 7th grade French class, thinking only of the immediate security of my body, regarding France as one might regard Jupiter. But now your mother had gone and done it, and when she returned, her eyes were dancing with all the possibilities out there, not just for her, but for you and for me. It is quite ridiculous how the feeling spread. It was like falling in love. The things that get you are so small. The things that keep you up at night are so particular to you that when you try to explain, the only reward anyone can give you is a dumb, polite nod. Your mother had taken many pictures all through Paris of doors, giant doors, deep blue, ebony, orange, turquoise, and red burning doors. I examined the pictures of these giant doors in our small Harlem apartment. I'd never seen anything like them. It had never even occurred to me that such giant doors could exist, could be so common in one part of the world and totally absent in another. And it occurred to me, listening to your mother, that France was not a thought experiment, but an actual place filled with actual people whose traditions were different, whose lives really were different, and whose sense of beauty was different. When I look back, I know that I was then getting the message from all over. By that time, my friends included a great number of people with ties to different worlds. Make the race proud, the elders used to say. But by then, I knew I wasn't so much bound to a biological race as to a group of people. And these people were not black because of any uniform color or any uniform physical feature. They were bound because they suffered under the weight of the dream. And they were bound by all the beautiful things, language, mannerisms, food and music, literature and philosophy, all the common language that they fashioned like diamonds under the weight of the dream. Not long ago, I was standing in an airport retrieving a bag from a conveyor belt. I bumped into a young black man and said, "My bad." Without even looking up, he said, "You straight." And in that exchange, there was so much of the private rapport that can only exist between two particular strangers of this tribe that we call black. In other words, I was part of a world, and looking out, I had friends who, too, were part of other worlds. The world of Jews or New Yorkers, the world of Southerners or gay men, or immigrants, or Californians, of Native Americans, or a combination of any of these worlds stitched into worlds like tapestry. And though I could never myself be a native of any of these worlds, I knew that nothing so essentialist as race stood between us. I had read too much by then, and my eyes, my beautiful, precious eyes, were growing stronger each day. And I saw that what divided me from the world was not anything intrinsic to us, but the actual injury done by people intent on naming us, intent on believing that what they have named us matters more than anything we could ever actually do. In America, the injury is not in being born with darker skin, with fuller lips, with a broader nose, but in everything that happens after. In that single exchange with that young man, I was speaking the personal language of my people. It was the briefest intimacy, but it captured much of the beauty of my black world. The ease between your mother and me, the miracle at the Mecca, the way I felt myself disappear on the streets of Harlem. To call that feeling racial is to hand over all those diamonds fashioned by our ancestors to the plunderer. We made that feeling, though it was forced in the shadow of the murder, the rape, the disembodied. We made it all the same. This is the beautiful thing that I have seen with my own eyes, and I think I needed this vantage point before I could journey out. I think I needed to know that I was from somewhere, that my home was as beautiful as any other. 7 years after I saw the pictures of those doors, I received my first adult passport. I wish it had come sooner. I wish when I was back in that French class that I had connected the conjugations, verbs, and gendered nouns to something grander. I wish someone had told me what that class really was, a gate to some other blue world. I wanted to see that world myself, to see the doors and everything behind them. The day of my departure, I sat in a restaurant with your mother who showed me so much. I told her, I am afraid. I didn't really speak the language. I did not know the customs. I would be alone. She just listened and held my hand. And that night, I boarded a starship. The starship punched out into the dark, punched through the sky, punched out past West Baltimore, punched out past the Mecca, past New York, past any language in every spectrum known to me. My ticket took me to Geneva first. Everything happened very fast. I had to change money. I needed to find a train from the airport into the city, and after that, find another train to Paris. Some months earlier, I had begun a halting study of the French language. Now I was in a storm of French, drenched really, and only equipped to catch drops of the language. Who, euros, you, to the right. I was still very afraid. I surveyed the railway schedule and became aware that I was one wrong ticket from Vienna, Milan, or some village that no one knew or had ever heard of. It happened right then. The realization that being far gone, the fear, the unknowable possibilities, all of it, the horror, the wonder, the joy, fused into an exotic, erotic thrill. The thrill was not wholly alien. It was close to the wave that came over me in Moreland. It was kin to the narcotic shot I'd gotten watching people with their wine glasses spill out onto West Broadway. At that moment, I realized that those changes, agony, awkwardness, confusion, were the defining fact of my life. And for the first time, I knew not only that I was really alive, that I really was studying and observing, but that I had been long alive, even back in Baltimore. I had always been alive. I was always translating. I arrived in Paris. I checked into the hotel in the 6th arrondissement. I had no understanding of the local history at all. I did not think much about Baldwin or Wright. I had not read Sartre or Camus, and if I had walked past Café de Flore or Les Deux Magots, I did not then take any particular note. None of that mattered. It was Friday, and what mattered were the streets thronged with people in amazing configurations. Teenagers together in cafes, school children kicking the soccer ball on the street, backpacks to the side, older couples in long coats, billowing scarves and blazers, 20-somethings leaning out of any number of establishments looking beautiful and cool. It recalled New York, but without the low-grade, ever-present fear. The people wore no armor or none that I recognized. Side streets and alleys were bursting with bars, restaurants, and cafes. Everyone was walking. Those who were not walking were embracing. I was feeling myself beyond any natural right. My Caesar was geometric. My lineup was sharp as a sword. I walked outside and melted into the city like butter in the stew. In my mind, I heard Big Boy sing, I'm just a player like that. My jeans was sharply creased. I got a fresh white t-shirt and my cap was slightly pointed east. I had dinner with a friend. The restaurant was the size of 2 large living rooms. The tables were jammed together, and to be seated, the waitress employed a kind of magic, pulling one table out and then wedging you in like a child in a high chair. You had to summon her to use the toilet. All right. And so I almost made it through my entire reading on Periscope. So I'm going to have to go back and start us back up again. All right, sorry about that. Periscope just stopped on me all of a sudden, but we are coming to the close of our reading today, and we are right in the middle of Tanehisi describing his trip to Paris. All right. When it was time to order, I flailed at her with my catastrophic French. She nodded and did not laugh. She gave no false manners. We had an incredible bottle of wine. I had steak, I had a baguette with bone marrow, I had liver, I had an espresso and a dessert that I can't even name. Using all the French I could muster, I tried to tell the waitress the meal was magnificent. She cut me off in English. The best you've ever had, right? I rose to walk, and despite having inhaled half the menu, I felt easy as a featherweight. The next day, I got up early and walked through the city. I visited the Musée Rodin. I stopped in a bistro, and with all the fear of a boy approaching a beautiful girl at a party, I ordered 2 beers and then a burger. I walked to Les Jardins du Luxembourg. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I took a seat. The garden was bursting with people, again, in all their alien ways. At that moment, a strange loneliness took hold. Perhaps it was that I had not spoken a single word of English that entire day. Perhaps it was that I had never sat in a public garden before, had not even known it to be something that I wanted to do. And all around me, there were people who did this regularly. It occurred to me that I really was in someone else's country, and yet in some necessary way, I was outside of their country. In America, I was part of an equation, even if it wasn't a part I enjoyed. I was one of the police stopped on 23rd Street in the middle of a workday. I was one driven to the Mecca. I was not just a father, but the father of a black boy. I was not just a spouse, but the husband of a black woman, a freighted symbol of black love. But sitting in that garden for the first time, I was an alien, I was a sailor, landless and disconnected. And I was sorry that I had ever felt this particular loneliness before, that I had never felt myself so far outside of someone else's dream. Now I felt the deeper weight of my generational chains, my body confined by history and by policy to certain zones. Some of us make it out, but the game is played with loaded dice. I wished I had known more, and I wished I had known it sooner. I remember that night watching the teenagers gathering along the pathway near the scene and to do all of their teenage things. And I remember thinking how much I would have loved for that to have been my life. How much I would have loved to have a past apart from the fear. I did not have that past in hand or memory, but I had you. We came back to Paris that summer because your mother loved the city and because I loved the language, but above all because of you. I wanted you to have your own life apart from fear, even apart from me. I am wounded. I am marked by old codes which shielded me in one world and then chained me in the next. I think of your grandmother calling me and noting how you were growing tall and would one day try to test me. And I said to her that I would regard that day, should it come, as a total failure of fatherhood, because if all I had over you were my hands, then I really had nothing at all. But forgive me, son, I knew what she meant, and when you were younger, I thought the same. And now I am ashamed of the thought, ashamed of my fear of generational chains I tried to clasp onto your wrists. We are entering our last years together, and I wish I had been softer with you. Your mother had to teach me how to love you, how to kiss you and tell you I love you every night. Even now, it does not feel a wholly natural act so much as it feels like a ritual. And that is because I am wounded. That is because I am tied to old ways which I learned in a hard house. It was a loving house, even as it was besieged by its country, but it was hard. Even in Paris, I could not shake the old ways, the instinct to watch my back at every pass and always be ready to go. A few weeks into our stay, I made a friend who wanted to improve his English as much as I want to improve my French. We met one day out in the crowd in front of Notre Dame. We walked to the Latin Quarter. We walked to the wine shop. Outside the wine shop, there was seating. We sat and drank a bottle of red. We were served heaping piles of meats, bread, and cheese. Was this dinner? Did people do this? I had not even known how to imagine it. And more, this was all some elaborate ritual to get an angle on me. My friend paid. I thanked him. But when we left, I made sure he walked out first. He wanted to show me one of those old buildings that seemed to be around every corner in that city. And the entire time he was leading me, I was sure he was going to make a quick turn into an alley where some dudes would be waiting to strip me of what exactly? But my new friend simply showed me the building, shook my hand, gave me a fine bonsoir, and walked off into the open, wide night. And watching him walk away, I felt that I had missed part of the experience because of my eyes. Because my eyes were made in Baltimore. Because my eyes were blindfolded by fear. What I wanted was to put as much distance between you and that blinding fear as possible. I wanted you to see different people living by different rules. I wanted you to see couples sitting next to each other in cafes, turned out to watch the street, the women pedaling old bikes up the streets without helpmeets in long white dresses, the women whizzing past in Daisy Dukes and pink roller skates. I wanted you to see the men in salmon-colored pants and white linen and bright sweaters tied around their necks, the men who disappeared around corners and circled back in luxury cars with the top down, loving their lives. All of them smoking, all of them knowing that either grisly death or an orgy awaited them just around the corner. Do you remember how your eyes lit up like candles when you stood out on the Saint Germain des Prés? That look was all that I lived for. And even then, I wanted you to be conscious, to understand that to be distanced, if only for a moment, from fear is not a passport out of the struggle. We will always be Black, you and I, even if it means different things in different places. France is built on its own dream, on its collection of bodies, and recall that your very name is drawn from a man who opposed France and its national project of death by colonization. It is true that our color was not our distinguishing feature there, so much as the Americanness represented in our poor handle on French. And it is true that there is something particular about how the Americans who think they are white regard us, something sexual and obscene. We were not enslaved in France. We are not their particular problem, nor their national guilt. We are not their niggers. If there is any comfort in this, it is not the kind that I would encourage you to indulge. Remember your name. Remember that you and I are brothers, are the children of transatlantic rape. Remember the broader consciousness that comes with that. Remember that this consciousness can never ultimately be racial, it must be cosmic. Remember the Roma you saw begging with their children in the street and the venom with which they were addressed. Remember the Algerian cab driver speaking openly of his hatred of Paris, and then looking at your mother and me and insisting that we were all united under Africa. Remember the rumbling we all felt under the beauty of Paris, as though the city had been built in abeyance of Pompeii. Remember the feeling that the great public gardens, the long lunches, might all be undone by a physics cousin to our rules and the reckoning of our own country that we do not fully comprehend. It was good to have your Uncle Ben and Aunt Janai there, someone else who had to balance the awe of what these people had built and the fact of whom they built so much of it upon. Someone else who learned to travel in adulthood, people who'd been Black in America and were mostly concerned with the safety of their bodies. And we were all aware that the forces that held back our bodies back at home were not unrelated to those that had given France its wealth. We were aware that much of what they had done was built on the plunder of Haitian bodies, the plunder of Wolof bodies, on the destruction of the Tokolur and the taking of Bisandegu. That was the same summer that the killer of Trayvon Martin was acquitted. The summer I realized that I accepted that there is no velocity of escape. Home would find us in any language. Remember when we took the train up to Place de la Nation to celebrate your birthday? Remember the young man standing outside the subway in protest? Do you remember his sign? Vive le combat des jeunes contre les crimes racistes. USA. Trayvon Martin, 17, ans assassiné, car noir et les racistes acquittés. Whew. Let me just rewind. He said a lot. One of the things that I think is important, especially for those of us who have traveled outside of the United States. I have had the opportunity to travel outside of the United States. And I found it very interesting because when I traveled outside of the United States, I don't think that there was one time when I actually felt in fear of my safety. But I traveled to a Caribbean island, right? And one of the things that amazed me about traveling to a Caribbean island was I noticed that racism was not just an American problem. Traveled to Trinidad, Tobago, and they have their own racial or ethnic identity issues with each other. So that was one of the first things I noted. One of the things here he talks about that I think is really good is that he wanted to distance himself, and he wanted his son to experience a experience in another country that had nothing to do with binding fear, with a fear that he kind of alluded to, that held Black bodies down, that weighted Black bodies in America down, that people were, fearing for their life. And this notion that he talks about throughout this reading is that you could be disembodied or disconnected from your body, or your body could be taken from you at any time because of the way that the American dream is set up. The other piece he talked about here is that the way that the people in Paris treated the Roma or the Gypsies, right? And this whole notion that every country has a group of people that is somewhat targeted and they are mistreated. So even if you go to another country and you may not experience that targeting, there is a group there that experiences it. And so, like he said here, the Roman, the children begging in the street, and the venom with which they were addressed, that's something that you wouldn't necessarily know about unless you read about it or you visited Paris yourself. Then he talked about the Algerian cab driver who spoke openly of his hatred of Paris. So it's kind of like, regardless of where you go and you're going to another country and you're experiencing the beauty of that country, just know that there could be people inside of that same country, just like people come to America and say, oh, America's so wonderful. Oh my gosh, there's so much opportunity. Well, it depends on who the country is willing to open up opportunity to. That will determine your experience in America. Who does the country give loans to when they come to start business? That might determine how you feel about America. So yes, some people come here and they're like, oh my gosh, this is wonderful. There's so many opportunities, yada, yada, yada. But some of those same opportunities that are open to immigrants who come are not open to Black Americans who have been here and their ancestors have been here for hundreds of years. So yes, there's going to be a different thought process about what this country actually offers. What was the last piece I wanted to go back to before we close out? Oh yeah. He talks about this notion of fatherhood and this notion of how we raise Black children in America. And of course, we could probably argue that other children in different countries experience this, but I know this to be definitely true of Black America. We tend to think that beating everything out of a child is success. We tend to think that if I beat the child, they will straighten up. No matter how stubborn they are, if I just keep beating them, things will turn out okay. And we get this from a misinterpretation of spare the rod, spoil the child. And if you actually dig into that scripture, you'll recognize that they're not talking about beating your child and whipping your child. It's actually talking about instructing your child. But sometimes people believe, they don't have the patience for instruction, so they move right to physical. And one of the things that I want to go back to what he said here is that he said, if He considered himself a total failure as a father if all he had to offer his sons, or if all he had over him, right, to discipline him was his hands, then he really had nothing at all. That's beyond powerful. If all I have to instill instructions in you that's going to help you in life is my hands, and to do it by my hands, then I really have nothing at all. Then he says, he recognizes that something that a lot of parents don't recognize about themselves. He recognizes it is because I am wounded. If all I can offer you to discipline you is my hands and not verbal instruction, there's something in me that is wounded, that that resorts to just physical and not taking the patience to discipline my own child. But he said, I learned it in a hard house. It was a loving house, even as it was besieged by its country, but it was hard. Even in Paris, I could not shake the old ways and the instinct to watch my back at every pass and always be ready to go. So, he learned it in a house that was hard. And like he said, if all I have, he said, as a total failure, I count it as a total failure of fatherhood, because if all I had over you were my hands, then I really had nothing at all. There's got to be other ways of teaching and sharing and transferring knowledge to your children other than physically putting your hands on them. Yeah. Interesting. So as we close today, and he talks about, at the end here, he talks about, amen. At the end here, he talks about people who have been Black in America are mostly concerned with the safety of their bodies. I'm going to have to agree with him on that. Because in many instances, we feel like we don't have a lot of control over external things concerning our bodies, especially in the climate in which we live now. And so that is a real concern. But as he said, once he got out of the United States, it was even hard for him to let go of that notion, being in another country where he got a chance to experience the country, but he also felt held back in his experience because of how much of his life was spent guarding his body. So he missed out on some of that experience, but he wanted his son to have a different experience at a younger age. Like he said, he got his passport when he was older, and he wished he had done it sooner. Travel, visit other places, see other people, understand how other countries live, understand they have different sets of cultural codes. I think that is an excellent point, that if you're a Black American, you need to be able to leave the country and see Blackness in a different setting. It will probably, I believe it will change your life. But as he said here, the summer that they were in Paris was the summer that the killer of Trayvon Martin was acquitted. And even though they were in another country trying to enjoy Paris, that news reached all over the world, and they were still confronted with what was going on in America because somebody in Paris had a sign up in French talking about how Trayvon Martin, 17 years old, was assassinated. So it's even if you try to go enjoy your Blackness in another country, you're still confronted by what America is doing to Black people in other countries. I can understand that feeling. It's like, can we get to a place to where internationally our country is not known for the human rights abuses of Black people? Like, is that even a concern for the United States, that everybody knows what you guys are doing to the Black body here? And you think it's cool and you think it's okay. But the international world is looking at us like, what is wrong with you people? It's going on almost 400 years since the first group of slaves arrived. And y'all are still doing the same stuff. Like, at what point do you think God is going to get tired? Forget the world. At what point do we think God is going to say enough and give us his own answer? Because clearly we're not listening. We're not listening to Black mothers. We're not listening. We just keep going on about our business like, oh, this is okay what we're doing. When the United Nations itself has already condemned the United States for their human rights abuses, specifically against Black people. It's on record. But yet we're walking around here acting like we're not abusive to a specific people group. Now the world recognizes it. Why don't we recognize it? Anyway, that is our talk for today. I'm going to, give me 1 second, I'm going to come right back. I'm going to go over to my living room area and I'm going to come right back and I'm going to show you some of the books that we're going to be reading for 2017. So give me just a moment. All right. Sorry about that. I should have had them right here on the table in front of me. So, 2017. These are some of the books that we are going to be looking at, and I want to show these to you all before we close for today. We're going to be checking out Mark Lamont Hill's book, Nobody, Casualties of America's War on the Vulnerable from Ferguson to Flint and Beyond. And he really talks about what is happening in these communities. Why are these communities, it seems like, being targeted? The history of these particular neighborhoods. Why are people protesting in these specific places? And he talks about the conditions that have been brewing for years, that when you finally see a neighborhood like these come to the forefront, it's not just something that happened overnight, but it's been the result of conditions building up in those communities. We are also going to look at The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. This is the actual book on which the documentary 13th was created from. So if you've seen the documentary 13th, this is actually the book that it's based around, and Michelle Alexander is actually interviewed in 13th. But this will give us more specific detail than the documentary does, that talks about how basically slavery never ended. It just was translated over into the prison population. So this is what we're going to be looking at 2017. We're also going to be looking at Forbidden Religion. This is called Forbidden Religion, Suppressed Heresies of the West. So we'll be looking at some of these people who were involved in New Age stuff, New Age religions, things like that in the early parts of America, in other countries, and what the United States was doing to suppress these heresies from coming over to the West. Like, there were certain things that was going on that the United States in the early formation was like, no, 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 you can't bring that over here. You can't bring that demon over here. Unfortunately, some of this stuff has managed to still make it into the United States and make it into mainstream. And so as we study, you may actually recognize some of this stuff as operating in your local church, which is not a good thing, but at least you will understand where it came from. So I'm going to tackle that. We're also going to look at they came before Columbus. Now, I've been talking about this for a while, but this book is actually really, really hard to find. And I don't know how it was just sitting on the shelf, but I found it and I was like, oh, I have to buy this immediately. But it's called They Came Before Columbus, The African Presence in Ancient America. Most of us think that our ancestors were brought here, but research actually shows that some of us were not brought here. Some of us were already here. Our ancestors were already here. Yeah, right along with the Native Americans, some of them before the Native Americans. So that's a part of American history that nobody talks about. It's not in the history books. So we're going to dive into that. They came before Columbus. Let's see. The poverty of nations. I actually got a chance to hear this gentleman speak in DC, and he was at a policy summit that I got a chance to attend, and he was talking about solutions to poverty across the world. And his name is Wayne Grudem, and Barry Asmus was his co-writer. But they talk about that there is a solution to ending poverty, that eradicating poverty is possible if we would stop being greedy. But that's a whole other preach sermon. So this is talking about a sustainable solution for eliminating poverty. And he talks about the values of a system. Like, what are the values of systems that have learned how to eliminate poverty? He talks about moral advantages of establishing a system to end poverty. He talks about the economic system of a country that is ready and willing to end poverty. So this will be more of the scholarly type of reading. So it needs to be done. We need to learn. And finally, and like I said, this is some of the books that we'll be digging into for 2017. It's not all of them. And finally, The State of Jones. If you have not seen the movie that came out called The Free State of Jones, I highly recommend that movie. This book, well, the movie is based on this book. And this book is about a small southern county that seceded from the Confederacy during the Civil War. Awesome, 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 excellent movie that basically shows that not all of the white people in the South were going into the Confederacy to fight. There were actually people that deserted the Confederate Army and said, heck no, we won't go. And they actually joined forces with the slaves. And this particular county was able to pull away while all of this stuff was happening. While the Civil War was going on, they were like, no, we're not participating. So I encourage you to watch the movie. You can get it on Redbox. I think it's available now. So $1.50 for it. Powerful movie. And that's some of the things we will be reading for 2017. So all of that being said, I hope that you're having a great and wonderful day. Well, if I am able to connect with a Christian university, they might let me do college credit for my Read Aloud course. So maybe somebody can email me about that. But I would love to allow people to get college credit, because all of those books are considered scholarly writing. So yeah, if we can get someone to connect with us, my email is reach Shantae, reach SHANTAE, Shantae@gmail.com. And if we can get a university connect and allow people to get college credit for the read alouds and discussion, that'd be awesome. All right. So thank you so much for joining us today. I know I'm a little bit over time, but we had some technical difficulties here with the Periscope. But thank you all so much for joining me. I will be back tonight at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with our Bible study that we just kicked off yesterday. And amen. I hear you. And so we'll be back at 5 p.m. If you're interested in Bible study, we will be back talking about nothing in me. And we're going to be looking at Cain this evening. Cain this evening. We want to make sure that as we're going into 2017, that we have nothing in us that is going to hinder the move of God and the flow of God going into our 2017. So we are going to be studying and looking at Cain's life and what we can learn from Cain and what we don't want to have in us going into 2017. So I bid you a wonderful day, wonderful afternoon. And if you want to, join me at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time right here on Periscope. Take care and God bless. Thank you again for joining us. And I hope that you too will join us by live stream at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our Bible study. Take care and God bless.